Kimberly, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I also, before I begin, I'd like to thank some of the folks who made this event possible and so wonderfully successful so far this evening. First, my associate, Dr. Marina Traviakas, who's the Associate Director of the Institute for Human Security. Emily Schipper, is Emily here? From the Special Events Office, Sherry Callender, my wonderful staff assistant. Thank you all for the wonderful efforts you've put in tonight and for many weeks and days before. I also want to add my thanks to the Leir Charitable Foundations and most especially to Arthur Hoffman and Margot Gibbous for their continuing support of the Institute for Human Security. As Kimberly has mentioned, and more broadly, the mission of the Institute has never been more critical. What we are focusing on is generating the analysis and the policy insights necessary to improve the security and well-being of individuals and communities throughout the world. In order to do that, we're focusing on research and policy analysis in three broad areas: the protection and promotion of the rights of at-risk populations, particularly women, children, minority groups, and migrants. Secondly, the empowerment of people through dialogue, negotiation, political participation, and training. And thirdly, the promotion of responsible government and institutional practices to better respond to development rights and conflict-related challenges. The Institute for Human Security, with the wonderful support we've received from the Leir Foundation, draws upon and in turn catalyzes the talents of our faculty and students. From its inception, the Institute has brought together world-class scholar practitioners from the fields of development, human rights, conflict resolution, and humanitarian studies to share their extensive experience through teaching and publications. It's also provided financial support to doctoral students pursuing their dissertation research, many of whom are here tonight, as well as to master's degree candidates completing their capstone projects or summer internships. And in addition to continuing these wonderful programs, we want to inaugurate and will inaugurate and are inaugurating this year a new initiative of the Institute, which is the annual Leir Human Security Award. The purpose of the award is to acknowledge a Fletcher graduate, a Fletcher alum, who has made an exemplary contribution to the study and/or practice of human security. And I am so pleased and honored tonight to introduce this year's recipient, the first recipient of this award, Dr. Maria Stephan. Maria is a senior policy fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she focuses on the dynamics of civil resistance and its relevance for violent conflict prevention and democratic development. Previously, she was the lead foreign affairs officer in the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where her last assignment entailed engaging the Syrian opposition in Turkey. No small feat. Earlier, she was detailed to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, to focus on subnational governance and civil military planning. Prior to government service, Maria directed policy and research at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Of particular note is Maria's research with Erica Chenoweth that culminated in the 2011 book, Why Civil Resistance Works: The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. This book was the recipient of the 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Prize by the American Political Science Association for the best book published in political science of that year, and the prestigious University of Louisville Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Maria, it is a great, great privilege and honor to congratulate you and to ask you to come up and receive this award, which I am sure is only the beginning of your contribution to human security.
thank you, Eileen, so much for that kind introduction. And it's really an honor to receive this award and to be with everybody this evening. Eileen, I should note, not only helped me get across the PhD finish line here at Fletcher, but she's really been a patient and honorable mentor and friend ever since I graduated from the Fletcher School. So thank you so much, Eileen. And I'm excited that Eileen is leading the Leir Institute for Human Security and now spearheading efforts together with Marina and with Kimberly, our terrific new endowed chair of international humanitarian studies, to bridge the academic policy divide, to bust some disciplinary silos, and help improve human well-being in conflict-affected parts of the world. It's really great to be back on campus. I love always being at Fletcher with so many friends, family, and supporters. I'd like to give a special shout out to my wonderful parents, Marianne and Phil, who are seated here in the front row. They've schlepped down from Vermont and have been really my lifetime anchors. And at this point, honestly, they must know as much, if not more, about civil resistance and the dynamics of nonviolent movements as me. I'd also like to thank the Dean Stavridis, for his great energy and leadership, and for doing such an amazing job marketing for Fletcher every day. I don't even get cable television, and I see him on CNN every single day. So thank you to the Dean. And also a big thanks, as I mentioned earlier this evening, for endorsing my last book, Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback?, which was published this year by the Atlantic Council. That endorsement no doubt boosted sales exponentially and made dictators around the world shake a little bit in their boots. So thank you. And then there are my other two dissertation dads, if you will, Professor Dick Schultz and Dr. Peter Ackerman, both of whom I'd like to recognize this evening. The International Security Studies program, with Professor Schultz's blessing, was the first department to mainstream literature and case studies of nonviolent resistance in its courses. And I should point out, given tonight's theme on gender and security, has supported a large number of Fletcher women in the security studies field. Professor Schultz also hooked me up with an ISSP sweatshirt, which you might imagine is in hot demand in Washington and around the world. So I was very happy about that. Peter Ackerman, the one-time chairman of the Fletcher board, is a pioneer in the field of nonviolent resistance, who was writing about it at a time when it really was not cool. Although I feared Peter when he was on my committee, he has since become a compatriot. I admire Peter for spending decades helping people around the world learn about how nonviolent struggle can be waged strategically. With Peter's help, there is now a Fletcher Summer Institute for the Advanced Study of Nonviolent Conflict here at Fletcher. And now with the generous financial support from another great man, Sid Topol, who has helped create the Topol Fellows Program in Nonviolent Resistance here at Fletcher, I feel like people power is on the up and up, which is a good thing for the world. And now I would especially like to thank the Leir Foundation and Board for their generosity in endowing a chair in human security at Fletcher and for sponsoring this award. Their vision of a world in which there is freedom from fear and freedom from want is compelling. Peoples around the world, be they from Uganda, Bahrain, Belarus, Afghanistan, Honduras, or Syria, or even here in the United States, are fighting for these freedoms every day. The Leir Institute and Endowed Chair are great investments in Fletcher, which, as we all know, is at the forefront of making the theoretical come to life in very practical ways in order to support a more just, peaceful, and secure world. In short, a world where human security is front and center. By way of story, I started at the Fletcher School in 2000 after having lived in Europe, and with the support of two amazing Boston College professors, one of whom is here tonight, Professor Michael Ressler from the German department at BC. I was studying how decades of post-World War II European integration made war between EU member states unthinkable, and how Franco-German reconciliation and pragmatic peace-building motored it. For all of its bumps and bruises, I still consider European integration to be one of the greatest peace processes in the history of the world. But it turned out that another nonviolent process, one involving organized groups of people or overcoming fear and challenging injustices via active nonviolent means, captured my imagination even more. At Fletcher, with the support of Professors Babbitt, Schultz, Johnstone, and Hannum, and I see Professor Hannum here tonight, took 3 of his courses, which meant about 150 pages worth of seminar papers, if I'm not mistaken. Through these Fletcher professors, I took a keen interest in intra-state conflicts, which continue to wreak the most havoc around the world. I wanted to understand how asymmetric conflicts, the proverbial David against Goliath scenarios, if you will, could be transformed without violence. How ordinary people facing profound societal injustices, repression, and institutionalized discrimination, whether they were minorities, indigenous peoples, other persecuted groups, could organize, resist, and win. As an aside, in Vermont, where I grew up, community organizing and self-reliance are big parts of the state ethos. Well, actually, I was reminded earlier, for one of Professor Hannum's courses, I in fact argued that Vermont is a nation with the right of self-determination. And I think he may have even bought that argument, but I can't remember. And also in Vermont, my parents certainly inspired me with their own involvement in social justice issues and countless volunteer activities. So that upbringing definitely informed my worldview. But I didn't appreciate then what I know now, namely that nonviolent resistance is a skills-based activity that can outperform even the most formidable, militarily superior opponents. And then, here in Boston, I saw a movie downtown, on 1 Milk Street to be exact. It was the first screening of the Emmy Award-nominated documentary film, A Force More Powerful, which chronicled struggles for justice and freedom in places as diverse as India, Denmark, Chile, Poland, South Africa, and the United States. These were struggles against opponents willing to use violence, sometimes brutal, against dissenters. Their weapons included boycotts, sit-ins, non-cooperation, protests, street theater, and satire. And they won against all odds. The film prompted an obvious question: how was this possible? So I ended up writing a Fletcher dissertation that compared the strategies of civil resistance against foreign military occupation in 3 self-determination movements in Kosovo, East Timor, and Palestine. And I was able to conduct field research in all 3 places. Luckily, I finished that PhD dissertation. So at this point, I'd actually like to show a little bit of solidarity with the current Fletcher PhD candidates who are in the audience. So why don't you stand up so everybody can see you. These are the people who deserve all of our love and solidarity. So after completing my PhD, I moved to Washington and began working at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, where I was regularly meeting with activists from some of the most repressive places around the world. Along the way, I met a really hardcore political scientist, Erica Chenoweth, who specializes in political violence, who delights in running regressions, and was genuinely doubtful about the efficacy of nonviolent resistance against the worst of the worst opponents. After a few late-night debates at a workshop in Colorado, we decided to conduct a study that would be the first of its kind to systematically compare violent and nonviolent resistance movements against the toughest opponents. By then, I had left the NGO and teaching world for the State Department, where I was deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan in 2009, which was the peak period of Taliban violence, fueled, I should note, in large part by corrupt governance that international donors were feeding. In between long, often 12-hour days working at our embassy, we had a former Army lieutenant general in charge at the time, who was our ambassador. And in between duck and cover sirens, which meant incoming mortar rounds and rockets, and in between bouts with Giardia and at least 2 other parasites, I worked on book chapters with Erica, who was across the world in California. We collected data on 323 major campaigns, violent and nonviolent, from 1900 to 2006, that had at least 1,000 observed participants. And we found that the nonviolent campaigns succeeded 53% of the time, compared to 26% of the time for violent campaigns. The results are almost identical when we included data from 2006 to 2014. Nonviolent campaigns, on average, attract vastly higher and more diverse levels of participation compared to armed campaigns, which helps to explain their success. Not only have nonviolent resistance campaigns been twice as effective historically as violent struggles, they also correlate strongly with post-transition democratization and with civil peace. Data that Erica crunched later reveal that countries emerging from armed struggles, as opposed to nonviolent campaigns, are 10 times less likely to transition to democracy within 5 years. On average, countries emerging from civil wars are 15% more likely to relapse into civil wars within a decade compared with countries that emerge from nonviolent uprisings. The humanitarian costs of violent conflicts, as we know, are high, with far greater fatality rates among the civilian population, as well as elevated risks of state-directed mass killings during and after the conflict. Just considering these findings and thinking about the Arab Spring, we can understand why Tunisia, which featured a mass, highly participatory, nonviolent popular uprising against the Ben Ali dictatorship, led by the same groups, labor and trade unions, lawyers groups, human rights organizations, that later mediated Tunisia's transition, is on the best path to democratic consolidation. Incidentally, the 4 Tunisian civil society organizations that led the National Dialogue Quartet were recently awarded the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, a truly fascinating case where nonviolent resistance, skillful negotiation, and peace building have come together to positive effect. That may just constitute a great Mauld thesis, just throwing it out there. Given the Institute for Human Security's focus on state fragility and civil wars, it strikes me that figuring out how to support nonviolent civic campaigns targeting the drivers of fragility and instability, which are often some combination of bad governance, corruption, and failed power sharing, is a worthy pursuit. I would also note that state fragility and inclusive peace processes are 2 major thematic areas at the United States Institute of Peace under its new president, Nancy Lindborg. Erica's and my research findings were certainly put to the test when I was deployed to Turkey to work with the Syrian opposition with the State Department. This was in mid-2012, over a year into a popular uprising against the Middle East's most repressive regime. It's hard to imagine now, with over 250,000 Syrians dead and half the population displaced, that the original challenge to the Assad regime, inspired by similar uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, featured kids spray painting defiant messages on walls, vibrant street demonstrations involving Sunni, Shia, Christian, Alawi, Kurds, Druze, songs of freedom, activists smuggling cameras, computers, smartphones across borders, boycotts of companies owned by the Assad family, etc. Sadly, time was not on the side of the Syrian revolution. and the regime's brutal response to peaceful protesters accelerated a turn to violence. It was very hard for the Syrian opposition, forced to live under divide and rule dictatorship for decades, to amass a coherent, long-term strategic challenge to the regime. Meanwhile, we in the international community were inadequately equipped and organized to support a fast-moving revolution. At the policy, strategy, and tactical levels, we simply were not good enough. By the time I arrived in Turkey, the Free Syrian Army, which had taken sanctuary inside the country, was starting to launch attacks. These were mostly civilians who had never picked up weapons before, who saw family members killed, raped, tortured, and took up arms for self-protection. Unfortunately, but predictably, the violence escalated quickly after that. The weapons flowed in on all sides, barrel bombs started falling, extremists filled the political vacuum, and we have the tragedy that we have today. Some of you in this room, I believe, had a chance to meet my dear Syrian friend, Hani El-Sayed, who graduated with the GMAP class of 2015, and who was forced to leave Damascus in 2012 after hosting the most popular radio show in the country for over a decade. Hani is an amazing humanitarian, and it is amazing for Fletcher to have in its alumni ranks those like her who are fighting for peace when their homelands are torn by civil war. Deeply affected by the tragedy in Syria, at so many levels, I left the US government a year and a half ago and started my current positions at the US Institute of Peace and the Atlantic Council in order to focus on the most promising pathways to help those like the courageous Syrians who waged nonviolent struggle for 8 months, some of whom continue to resist nonviolently today, to help level the playing field. The importance of international solidarity on behalf of those committed to advancing a just peace nonviolently cannot be overstated. Imagine for a moment how different our world would look if the principal method of waging conflict, one whose efficacy has been shown empirically, relied not on violence, but on active nonviolent means. This transformation faces huge obstacles, of course, but it is not impossible. I'm excited about the prospect of Fletcher leading the way on how to bring this practically about. At the Atlantic Council, which is a new institutional partner of the Fletcher School, I am co-leading a project with Matt Burrows called The Future of Authoritarianism. This project is a response to the troubling global trend of democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. Aggregate Freedom House scores on civil and political freedoms have declined for all of the last 11 years. Dozens of countries around the world have imposed draconian laws affecting civil society's ability to organize and hold governments accountable peacefully. Dissent is being criminalized, and massive sums are being invested in cyber repression in places ranging from Russia to Venezuela, from Ethiopia to Egypt. The scope, sophistication, and coordination of authoritarian crackdowns on domestic dissent is unprecedented. While the number of global protests has exploded this decade, we're in the most contentious period in history, in fact, our data show that the effectiveness of nonviolent campaigns has dropped to a level that we have not seen since the 1950s. So dictators are clearly learning more effectively from each other than activists are learning from each other. The closing space for civil society is, I believe, an underappreciated threat to international peace and security. Though there's greater focus on this issue now within the US government as part of the new Stand with Civil Society initiative, so much work needs to be done. I hope the Institute will take on this issue and examine how various economic, political, foreign aid, defense, and other tools can be used to help open up civic space as a means to prevent violence and to support social change through nonviolent means. One thing we know is that organized citizen movements have historically emerged and succeeded in some of the most unlikely places. However, less clear is how outside actors, state and non-state, can best support these movements, which are fluid, multi-actor, and engage in extra-institutional and often extra-legal tactics. This is the central focus of my work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where we are developing training and education tools, including a civil resistance online course that Althea Middleton-Detzner, a recent Fletcher alumna, helped develop. And we're conducting research to better understand the dynamics of these movements and how to transform conflicts and counter violent extremism by supporting nonviolent direct action actors. This is also the subject of a second book that Erica Chenoweth and I are currently writing together, which we hope will be useful for policymakers and practitioners. It's also the core mission of a small nonprofit that I work closely with, which is called RISE, RHIZE.org, which provides training and coaching for sustainable movement building worldwide. I'm thrilled that Fletcher boasts an institute that can focus on these tough topics. Innovative solutions to tough global problems emerge when different disciplines creatively collide. So to wrap these remarks so that the students in the audience can start to visualize the wine and cheese, I'd like to again thank the Leir family and foundation for their generosity, to Fletcher faculty and staff for keeping it real, to my friends and family who have played such special roles in my life, particularly my parents and my brother Peter out in LA, and to all those around the world who continue to fight nonviolently for basic human dignity and for security that is truly human-focused. Thank you.